technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and yes, we are live. I know there are a lot of talk shows where they'll have a guest, or they'll have a guest host, or they'll play tapes. We will be playing tapes on Christmas Eve and Christmas, but we are live this week and looking forward to a great conversation, because as we mentioned on Friday, we're going to be talking about some of these wonderful children's books that have been developed in First Liberty Institute, and we will bring back to the microphone Howard Goldthwaite, an individual that I've known for literally decades. And again, he is an individual who's been with First Liberty for about 3.5 years, Senior Director of Creative Strategy, and really leads in the marketing campaigns, published about 17 different books, but I'm going to hold up one for those of you watching online, one of 3, and this is the latest one called Our First Liberty. But we're going to get into all 3 of the books, which we've talked about before with him, one having to do with church state, one having to do with the Constitution, this one having to do with the Bill of Rights. And of course, you might remember I just recently sent out a booklet on how to think about the Bill of Rights from a Christian point of view. So in some respects, this would be great material. But Howard, first of all, I just want to say it is great to see you. Wish you, of course, a Merry Christmas. But most importantly, thank you for putting these books together, because you have written them, and then Benjamin Vincent have illustrated them, and they're just wonderful resources.
Well, I'm really, really glad that First Liberty gets behind them. No one was asking for kids' books at a law firm, and I said, kids need to be taught this stuff.
Yes.
A lot of kids aren't learning this in school. And I pitched the idea, and they said, that's a great idea. Let's do it.
And again, one of the things we talked about even on Friday, because we had Jeff Mateer here, is this would be great to have in the schools as well. I don't know if the schools would let them in. I think the Christian schools would let them in. But for you listening right now, you might say, well, I don't know what they're like. We have posted actually the videos that go with every one of the books. So you will see the first one is a video, Our First Liberty. The second one, Founded on Freedom, and then No Better Letter. And so this is where you could actually watch the video. And the videos take, round numbers about 4 or 5 minutes. And then there is also a flip book, which you can get, and those are free downloads as well, in case you'd like to read it to your children or grandchildren. And I know this week we're kind of thinking about Christmas, but we're heading to the 250th anniversary of this country. And we have, as you can see from some of the booklets I have here on church state, federalism, and Federalist Papers, and Patriot Preachers, and One Nation Under God, really are gearing up for that as well. And these are great resources for each one of these individuals that might want to benefit from this. And as you pointed out, certainly our children don't know about it. But I found most adults, as they start reading through this, said, I didn't know this. I didn't learn this in school. And that's one of the reasons you've done this, isn't it?
The first one I wrote was No Better Letter.
Yes.
It's about Thomas Jefferson's famous Danbury letter on the wall of separation between church and state. And I had never even really learned about that until I came to work at First Liberty. I heard Kelly talking about it and thinking, why wasn't I taught this in school? Kids should be taught this.
Yes.
Because today's kids will be America's future leaders, and they need to know these things.
Yes, and again, so you have really dug into history. But let's take the sort of in reverse order, but that's okay. The newest one is Our First Liberty, How the Constitution and the Bill of Rights Protect Our Freedoms, starting with the free exercise of faith. And again, I like to hold these up just to see how well the graphics are done. But let's also talk about how well they are written, since you are the one that writes them, and you have them in a poetic format, which makes them really enjoyable to listen to on the video or to read to your kids, your grandkids.
When I first started doing them, I thought nothing elevates a story to epic status like when it rhymes. Like, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. All of a sudden, it's an epic story if it rhymes. And it takes a lot longer, takes a lot more work to make it all rhyme and time out just right. But I think it's worth it. Because it's easier to learn and memorize and follow along as a kid.
Well, again, I love that soon after America just made its start, there still was a danger it might fall apart. The 13 days were showing frustration. They couldn't agree on a common foundation. A new course of action was needed because we all must agree on a same set of laws. And then you go in to talk about the fact that we had a heated debate, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Talk about that, because in some respects, when we talk about our Constitution or even the structure of our government, it goes back to some of the history which you've dug out.
It does. I know, like when a dog chases a car, what does he do once he catches it? Well, once we won the Revolutionary War, there was kind of a now what do we do phase.
Yes.
All of a sudden we're a country now. And they didn't have a same set of laws. There were 13 sets of laws. Mm-hmm. They were almost like 13 little mini countries functioning as loosely under a confederation. And they realized that isn't going to work. And so they went to work on this. They had two plans they were fighting over. The Virginia plan, which said all the states will have representation based on its population.
Yes.
And the New Jersey plan, which was a smaller state, said, oh, no, every state's going to have the same amount of representation. And so they went back and forth. And the compromise was that's why we now have a Senate and a House of Representatives.
Yes.
It all goes back to that argument.
And I think it makes some great deal of sense, too. The so-called bicameral legislature, which we have at the federal government, we have that in the states, with the exception of Nebraska, but every other one has some kind of breakdown. And that is, I think, one of those ideas that came early on. But also, when we talk about the Bill of Rights, I think it's important to recognize that this was the work of James Madison. Mm-hmm. And off air, I was telling you, and I think I've told this on air as well, there was a battle between James Monroe and James Madison. Turns out that Patrick Henry, everybody remember him, right? Give me liberty, give me death. Well, when he was governor, he was not a real fan of Madison. So what he did was he gerrymandered the district so that James Monroe and James Madison had to run against each other. Best of friends. And so ultimately Madison loses, later becomes president anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And interestingly enough, James Madison, in the campaigning, had people saying, we like the Constitution, but it doesn't guarantee the rights. And last Monday, you were on a lot of talk shows because last Monday was when we have the celebration of the Bill of Rights, right?
Yeah. Bill of Rights Day, December 15th, 1791. Mm-hmm. So just a quick timeline. The Revolutionary War took like 7 years, from 1776. They finally stopped fighting around 83. There was still another 4 or 5 years before they had a constitution and a president. So there was a kind of a limbo time.
Yes.
And it was very uncertain whether America was going to actually survive as a country. And so they finally got the Constitution. But people said, it describes the powers of government. What it doesn't describe is the rights of the citizens.
Yes.
And that's why they needed the Bill of Rights. And so Madison and his team went back to work. And then like 3 years of writing and debating and voting, it was finally ratified in 1791.
And again, you have all sorts of things in here because you had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. You had all sorts of battles about this. And if somebody has never really learned about how we got the Bill of Rights, that is certainly the case. Mm-hmm. And then we, of course, talk about the First through the 10th Amendments and all the significance. We're coming up to a break, so we'll come back and maybe talk about a few of those. Mm-hmm. And then we'll be getting into one on the Constitution founded on freedom. And then we'll get back to the original, the No Better Letter, which deals with the issue of church-state. And if you find this fascinating and would love to teach that, first of all, to yourself, then to your children and grandchildren, let me just point you to pointofview.net, and we have the link to every one of the videos that goes with this. Of course, you can also download the flip phone, the flip book, and a variety of other things that are there. But let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During the Christmas week, I like to revisit some of the Christmas carols we sing at this time of the year. In this case, I not only want to talk about one of those songs, but also point you to a film that gives you the backstory. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was known as America's poet and is known for the song I Heard the Bells. His story is faithfully told by the ministry Sight and Sound, which is best known for their live theater productions. I Heard the Bells was their first ever theatrical release, shown in theaters in December 2022. It is now available to you to purchase or to stream into your home. His song came at the end of a tragedy. In 1861, 2 years before writing this poem, his life was shaken when his wife was fatally burned in a fire. Her dress caught on fire, and he tried to extinguish the flames as best he could. She died the next morning, and his facial burns were so severe he couldn't even attend her funeral. He grew a beard to cover his burns and often feared that he would be committed to an asylum due to his grief. His oldest son, Charles, joined the Union Army without his father's blessing. After the Battle of Charlottesville, he fell ill with typhoid fever and was sent home to recover. He was able to rejoin his unit and was severely wounded at the Battle of New Hope Church in Virginia. Longfellow, a widowed father of 6 children, the oldest nearly paralyzed, reflected not only on his grief, but the country fighting a war against itself. He wrote a poem to capture the dissonance in his own heart and the world around him as he heard the Christmas bells. This Christmas season, we need to reflect on the hope we have in Christ, even in the midst of trials and tragedies that surround us. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Howard Goldthwaite. And again, if you'd like to know more about him, we certainly have a link to his information as well. I would encourage you to find out more because I am aware of many other books he's written besides these 3. I think last time I counted, it was up to 17 different books that I know, and I've got some around the corner here that you've written. But we are focusing some time and attention today on this series, and it is so well done because this one in particular, Our First Liberty, How the Constitution, the Bill of Rights protect our freedoms, starting with the free exercise of faith. And of course, that makes sense that you would talk about the First Amendment, but it is interesting, Howard, that I have done surveys, and I know other people have done surveys, or even take a microphone out of the studio here and ask some people, can you tell me what particular rights are guaranteed by the First Amendment? And you don't even get close to the answer, but it's a free exercise, of course, of speech, of press, the right of people to assemble. But that's after, of course, the establishment of religion and the prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it's all sorts of things that people don't know much about. And yet one of the things that's encouraging about this book, and even the article I've posted today, I don't know who Andrea is, but I came across this because she talks about the fact that the founders understood faith and freedom, and they talk about the Danbury Baptist letter, which we're going to get to in just a few minutes. They talk about a lemon test, which we've talked about with Kelly and Jeff continuously. Then she talks about the Coach Kennedy case in there. You'd think she was writing for you. Then she does quote a few others, one case that's an ADF case and all the rest. But I thought it was very powerful, and that's an article for you to read as well. We'll talk about it a little bit more in the next hour, but it talks about how the founders understood faith and freedom. And if you open up any constitution, I've got one right across the table here, the First Amendment talks about the freedom of religion. And Kelly has talked about the fact that it's our first freedom because if you look at some of these totalitarian governments, when they take over, the first thing they want to get rid of is religious liberty.
They don't want any authority higher than the government. And as soon as any government thinks they outrank God, all the other rights go away instantly.
One of the things I think so intriguing, and you've been around First Liberty to see the difference, I've known them for a lot longer, and we today really enjoy more religious freedom than any time since at least the 1920s. Maybe you could even have to go back further than that. And yet most people are unaware of that. And that's why I think it's really important for people to know about the Bill of Rights and to know all the victories that you and other religious organizations have been able to achieve through the Supreme Court just in the last few decades.
Well, First Liberty just had our 10th Supreme Court victory. We're 10-0, which is pretty incredible.
Yes.
And we have an overall win rate of about 90%, roughly, and which is pretty unheard of in the law world. So we're very, very, we give all the glory to God.
Yes. One of the things I think is so helpful is, in addition to 10 and 0, which is outstanding, there are a lot of victories that take place at the lower level. The other day, we talked about the fact that apparently, at least in one place in New York, you can't sell Christmas trees at Christmas time if you're a church.
Yeah.
And you're still engaging that one, aren't you?
Yeah. There's a church in New York, a Catholic church, I think. It's a fundraiser.
Yeah. And
it's a service to the community. Whether you're Catholic or not, you're going to want a Christmas tree. But the government said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. Everybody goes, why not? If we were atheists, we could sell them.
Yes.
But we can't because we believe in God? No.
What I think is so intriguing is that Kelly, if he were here, would remind us of what it was like not so long ago, because just down the road is Plano. Mm-hmm. And in the Plano Independent School District, not only would they not allow you to have any kind of religious symbolism, you only could have snow people. Maybe you could have Santa Claus, and you literally said snow people, whatever that is. And you couldn't even have red and green napkins. So they were so anti any kind of Christian ideas that even things that look like Christmas were declared unconstitutional, and that didn't last very long.
If you look at back in the 1700s, there were two big revolutions, America's and France.
Yes.
America's revolution was pro-religion. France's was very anti-religion.
Yes.
They enthroned reason, religion. In fact, they forced monks and priests and nuns to get married and renounce their vows of celibacy, because that's just too religious. We can't put up with that. And you wonder, and America was kind of gradually working towards that, anti-religion bias. And groups like First Liberty are really putting a stop to it.
Yes. Well, and again, you think about that, you would not maybe have had the American Revolution the way it was, and this now gets into our book, One Nation Under God, if you had not had the First Great Awakening. And so Jonathan Edwards and others, we can certainly mention as well, were certainly bringing about a religious revival. And so as a result, by the time it was the writing of the Constitution, many of those ideas made their way into the Constitution. Yeah. And then that was followed up with a second Great Awakening, Charles Finney and all the rest. Mm-hmm. Whereas, let's look at France for just a minute. Edmund Burke even wrote notes on the French Revolution. Most people know Burke for other things, that we actually have to stand for liberty. But nevertheless, he was evaluating the influence of Voltaire and Rousseau and all the rest. And so as a result, you had one revolution, the American Revolution was pro-God, and the other revolution, the French Revolution, was very much anti-God. Yeah. They not only wanted the priests and nuns to get married, but they didn't even like the idea of a 7-day week. So they tried to change the week from 7 days because they just didn't want to have the idea of a Sabbath or anything else. And I just think, again, we are the inheritors of the First Amendment, and that is certainly something you're known for.
Well, we're also kind of the guardians of it as First Liberty. The book, Our First Liberty, is named after the first liberty listed in the First Amendment, the free exercise of faith, which is also how First Liberty got our name.
Yes.
So the name kind of has layers of meaning there.
Let me just mention real quickly before we take a break and we'll get into the other books. Of course, the First Amendment is, of course, the freedom of religion, and then the freedom of speech, press, and the right to assemble. Second Amendment, you have that in there as well, and that is the idea that the rights of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. Third Amendment really doesn't show up very much. You do mention it about quartering the military, and that probably at one point was used as a really loose justification for the right to privacy, but that amendment really hasn't applied very much. But the rest, again, certainly are very important. The Fourth Amendment has to do with the protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment, that you should not be held liable. Of course, you can take the Fifth, which we talk about as well. Sixth Amendment has to do with the speedy trial. The Seventh Amendment has to do with the payments and also a jury trial. Eighth Amendment is to actually prevent cruel and unusual punishments. The Ninth Amendment, which is saying that any rights that are not enumerated should not be constrained to deny the people of those rights. And then, of course, as you point out, the 10th Amendment says that any rights not specifically enumerated to the federal government are retained by the people, basically by the states and the people. And so you take us through each one of those ideas. And again, we live in this world, even if you're not a lawyer, you're very much affected by the Bill of Rights.
Oh, yeah.
And you should really appreciate the fact that we went through quite a bit of discussion and debate and even continued a focus on how to stand up for the rights of the American people. So, again, I highly recommend the book, and if you would like to know more about it, you can go to firstliberty.org. But the other thing you can do is, if you go to our website right now, you see the picture of Howard Goldthwaite, click on the button that says See More, scroll down, and you will see that we have Our First Liberty, Founded on Freedom, and No Better Letter, and every one of those on video. And very, very well done.
We had the artwork done. I'm really proud of the artwork.
Very well done.
A local illustrator I've known for many years named Benjamin Vincent. He started out as a caricature artist at Six Flags.
Yes.
And he's great with likenesses.
Yes.
He really is. And it takes him several months to do all that because they're very detailed.
They're very well done.
And we had the artwork done the same aspect ratio as video, so we can make it work in both the books and in the videos.
So again, if you want to know what the books look like, you can go even during the break right now, and you will see that each one lasts about 4 or 5 minutes. Sometimes I have an initial introduction, which then makes it about 6 minutes. But during the break, you could actually watch one of the videos. And the first one is Our First Liberty. When we come back, we're going to talk about Founded on Freedom and then No Better Letter.
Yeah.
We are privileged to have Howard Goldthwaite. I was not going to let him sneak out by not talking about his other books because these are so well done. And I commend them to you. By the way, if you wanted to get actual printed copies, I'm sure First Liberty would make those available somehow. So certainly you can find out about them by going to the website at pointofview.net or simply go to firstliberty.org.
She'll go right to it.
All right, very good. Go right to the books. And I think we have the link there, so follow that, and we'll be right back.
Do not miss the fact that this is an exciting time in America. Record numbers of Gen Z returning to church, reading the Bible. God is clearly moving. But it's also a critical time. Without trustworthy biblical guidance, without spiritual mentors willing to disciple, those young people full of zeal today could be led astray tomorrow. And that's why I urge you to partner with Point of View and equip the mentors the next generation needs. When you support Point of View, you provide a wealth of resources to equip Americans to think biblically about every issue relevant to life today. Your support could supply the tools that someone needs to apply biblical truth in discipleship. So partner with us today, and your gift will be doubled through December 31st. So give today at pointofview.net, or you can call us 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Or maybe you just want to sit back and take some notes, but we've been talking about Our First Liberty. I thought we'd talk about Founded on Freedom, which is on the Declaration of Independence, but also, in a sense, sets up the idea of the Constitution. Throughout the years of history's course, kings and dictators ruled by force is how it begins. And then it reminds us that New Yorkers, Rhode Islanders, Georgians, Virginians, they all met together to share their opinions. They pondered the country they always had wanted, and despite opposition, continued undaunted. A bold new plan they started to hatch. They decided to start a new country from scratch. Now, again, this one helps us understand why we have the Declaration, which is sort of the why of American government, and then the Constitution, if you will, is the how of American American government. And again, we have some booklets on that. Here's one on constitutional interpretation, one on the Federalist Papers, and many of the others. But again, this was a concept to actually think about whether or not these loyal individuals who were colonists, which were British citizens, could separate from this huge government and this huge empire, the British Empire. And that's exactly what they decided to do. And of course, that's why we celebrate the 4th of July. That's right. And we'll celebrate that 250 years later this coming July. And amazing.
And back in the day in England, there was zero separation between church and state. The king was head of both. And there's a verse in there. It says where King George is talking. He says, "Those in my church must do as I say, from the taxes they pay to the prayers that they pray."
Yes,
and people wanted to believe what they wanted to believe.
And again, one of the things that they would have been willing to go along with is if indeed they had been treated fairly, but they weren't. And of course, we are well aware of the fact that if you read through the Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to read it sometime on the air, it takes a while, and I'm encouraging people, especially on the 4th of July, to read it because that's the first thing people find out. There's a lot more to it than just this idea, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, because Thomas Jefferson lists all of the offenses, and most people maybe know one, no taxation without representation, but there are so many others. And in the original draft, Glenn Beck, you know who he is, he said, "I did not know until recently that the original draft actually condemned slavery and wanted to abolish the slave trade." So lots of people, if they dig into some of this, will find out some things, like you said, Howard, that we weren't taught in the public schools.
Yeah, I know. I grew up in the Fort Worth public schools, so that explains a lot, I guess. But I never learned about the several things. If they taught it, I slept through it. I didn't make it interesting enough to me to keep me awake. But I'd never learned about the Danbury letter as a kid.
But again, that was exactly what was going on here. And as you point out in here, you had a American Revolution. Yeah. Now we have this PBS special coming out, and already there's been a little bit of controversy about that, but that's fine because in some respects there is a lot to say about that. And as you point out, once you have the Declaration, then you have George Washington fighting. Of course, now since we're talking about Christmas and everything else, talking about fighting there in Princeton and Trenton and those kinds of things. But this is a 7-year battle. Yeah. And then once you now have a nation, we don't have a constitution. Yeah. We just have Articles of Confederation. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, they were sort of floating for a while. They were having trouble with the fact that, of course, since you didn't have a centralized government, it was just a number of different colonies were now part of a confederation. Your money wasn't worth a great deal, and some people had lost everything during the war. And so in some respects, this Constitution had to be pulled together, and yet there was as much dissension, probably more so dissension about the Constitution than there were about the Bill of Rights. Yeah.
Well, I know nowadays we talk about how people spin the news. Well, there are some people who spin history. Yes. They try to spin it away from their focus on God and the Bible. And if the deeper you dig, the more you keep discovering. Like even the Liberty Bell has a Bible verse inscribed on it.
Yes, it does. And so again, that just illustrates, as we've talked about before, some of that. And I've pointed out before in our little booklet on Patriot Preachers that if you really want to understand some of the ideas that first found their way into the Declaration of Independence, some of those ideas come from Virginia because they already had the Virginia Declaration. Some of the ideas that found their way in the Constitution came from the sermons of pastors in the 18th century. And so these ideas that oftentimes are kind of dismissed very easily are certainly, if you're willing to do the work and the research to begin to find out that a lot of that has been mispresented, which is really one of the reasons why you've done these books, because you felt that the next generation really needs to understand this country. And Howard, right now, I do get the sense that there isn't as much patriotism as there was, say, when we had the bicentennial in 1976. You and I are old enough to remember when we were talking about the 200th anniversary of America.
Big deal.
All sorts of
tall ships sailed in.
Yeah, all sorts of stuff. And now we're in the 250th anniversary, interestingly enough. And I think we need to do some real education. So if you go to our website, you'll see, of course, we have the Restoring America's Godly Heritage, America's 250th anniversary. And you can see why we are so excited about these books that Howard and First Liberty have put together, because they are great resources. But when we went to the break, we accidentally turned your microphone off. So let's talk about that again, because one of the things that people can do if they go to our website, pointofview.net, is they can see all three of the videos. But if they follow the link, they will see that the videos themselves, like firstliberty.org/no better letter or whatever it might be, but if you go to firstliberty.org/books, then you can actually have flip books. So
it makes the sound effect of a page turning.
Yes. And so I was going to put those up there, but I thought most people would enjoy just looking at these videos. And I just wanted to make kind of an assignment for some of our listeners right now to say, if this is something that you would like to teach your kids, maybe you could say, look, I want you to watch this video. Or maybe if you have an iPad, say, I want you to sit next to me and we're going to watch this video. It's only going to take you 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And this would be something that would be a great opportunity for teaching, because I can't even imagine how much time, energy, and resources you've spent putting these books together. At least you should ask some people to spend 5 minutes trying to learn a little bit from them.
It's not an exhaustive read. I know when I was a kid, I had to do a book report. I went to the library, looked for the skinniest book on the shelf. Well, I kept my own standard. These are very thin, and they're easy to read. They're elementary school kids, and they rhyme. Say, speaking of what, I remember years ago, I went to Thanksgiving Square in downtown Dallas. In the basement of Thanksgiving Square was a little museum back in the day, and they had like old Bibles from Puritan era and that kind of thing. And one of them was a book of the Psalms, and they rhymed, like a Bible that was written in rhyme. It's pretty, and I've since gone back and said, what happened to all this stuff? And I called the city and said, where's all that collection of great Bibles? Oh, it's all in storage.
Yeah.
They just don't show it anymore.
That's sad.
It's sad, yeah.
Well, again, you end this particular one, then we'll take a break and then talk about church state. Our taxes have never quite gone away, but religious liberty's here to stay. One thing's for sure, and this is a must, we'll only survive if in God we trust. That's how you end this book on the Declaration, which sets us up for the one on the Constitution. But nevertheless, it's a reminder that whether you look at the Declaration of Independence or the United States Constitution or the Bill of Rights, you see the hand of God in every one of those. Yeah. Some people say, well, where do you see it in the Declaration of Independence? Well, I just quoted the idea of we trust in and believe in God. There's also a statement as well about believing in divine providence, because ultimately they were fearful of the fact that they were now going to go to war, a revolution against the greatest military power of the 18th century. And then they also called upon God to make sure that their values and their attitudes were right. So either explicitly or implicitly, God is mentioned at least 3 or 4 times.
I know Thomas Jefferson had a famous kind of a catchphrase, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God.
Yes. So again, even when you go to the Jefferson Memorial, you see some of those things. So certainly, let's be honest, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin aren't the kind of people that signed the doctrinal statement of your church. Got that. But even they had some kind of theistic perspective, and so that runs through the Declaration as well.
You know, I've wondered if maybe Jefferson was such a fierce defender of religious liberty because his own beliefs were so off the beaten path. He wanted people to leave him alone.
It could be. But nevertheless, whether it's James Madison or Thomas Jefferson, certainly this idea of religious liberty. One more, and this was the original, No Better Letter. And you said you'd never learned about the Thomas Jefferson Danbury letter. So when we come back, we're going to learn about that. And that is very much like our church and state booklet that we have. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we'll talk about church and state. That's one of the booklets we have as well. But it comes from this book, No Better Letter, a story of Thomas Jefferson's Danbury letter on the separation of church and state. Now, one of the reasons, Howard, you wrote that is you said, I did not know about this 1801 letter that was coming out by Thomas Jefferson, then President of the United States. But I also had heard people talk about separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution. I always like to hold up my Constitution when somebody talks about separation of church and state and say, can you find that for me in there? Because I'll give you a clue. The word separation, the word state, and the word church are not in the First Amendment. It's right here, but it's nowhere to be found. And so in some respects, this was what started this whole series, and it's something that has been so successful. I hope you'll keep doing it.
Well, I hope so, too. As for the first book, that famous wall of separation is meant to keep the government out of the church, not to keep the church out of public life. And there's a drawing in there. Of
I love that drawing.
A little wall built around a church with a guy peeping over the edge, trying to see out. And that's not what Jefferson meant. He wanted churches to have the free exercise of their faith and not be constricted by government. And now it's exactly the opposite.
Let me just hold that up for those of you that might want to see that. Some of you tend to watch this online, and that is a diagram which I thought was so helpful because that's kind of the mindset that the secular world has, and yet it was nothing of the sort. It was a wall between the establishment of a national church. Recognize they'd all come from having a national church. You just talked about that a minute ago with the king, who was also the head of the church, and you even had to pay your, quote, tithe, if you will, your tithe and taxes to the church. Many of the colonies even had their own state churches, and one of the things they wanted to prevent was an establishment of a state church, and that's why the statement about the establishment of religion. But over time, that phrase, which sort of faded into obscurity, was then picked up in the 20th century in a famous case, and thus began to build this wall of separation. All of a sudden, we couldn't have prayer in the public schools, couldn't have Bible studies in the public schools. As this article that we posted here, we couldn't even post the Ten Commandments, Stone versus Graham. All of that has changed rather dramatically, in large part to some of the things that you, through First Liberty, have achieved. But going back to that, and originally, that's not what Thomas Jefferson intended, was it?
Not at all. In fact, the opposite.
Yes.
There's a line, sadly, his words have been misunderstood.
Yes.
They've been twisted to do more harm than good. And churches are always having to clarify what the wall of separation is meant to do. It's meant to keep the government out of the church business. They can't mandate our beliefs or tell us to stop practicing our faith in public or private.
Again, but that's not all what Jefferson meant when his original letter was sent. The wall of separation he wrote about was meant to keep the government out. The rights and freedoms his letter intended will always need to be strongly defended. That's why we have courts where justice shines bright, enforcing our laws and defending this right. It's just fascinating how you've written all of this. But again, it's an understanding, but it's a complete misunderstanding. Anybody that's ever been a public speaker on government probably can't even imagine the number of times they have heard. I'm not sure I've ever kept track of all the times I've heard people say, oh, wait a minute, what about separation of church and state? And that's why, of course, we have this little booklet that we've made available. And in the future, I think what we're going to try to do if we do some of these new booklets is even mention yours. I do mention, of course, Daniel Dreisbach. I showed you his book just a minute ago, Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State, probably one of the many classics that have been written over the years. But again, this is why we need to educate the younger generation. And each one of these books, you're really trying to provide almost a curricula that whether you're homeschooling your kids or whether your kids go to a Christian school and you would hope that these books might be in the library, or if your kids go to the public schools, you certainly want to try to educate them about some of these really important issues.
Well, I know when I was researching the No Better Letter, the separation of church and state, I looked at a whole lot of experts. And I was amazed how they could take something so interesting and make it so boring. No kid's going to read this, I thought. We got to make it fun. We got to make it rhyme, give it beautiful artwork, and then make it simple. I always say teaching is taking something complicated and making it simple. Academia is taking something simple and making it so complicated, only your fellow PhDs have any idea what you're talking about. And my wife's a PhD, so she would concur fully with that.
I might as well mention, Betsy's got her PhD, and she takes care of online education there at Liberty University.
Yeah, she is really doing wonders for that curriculum. She's examining all the courses on the online School of Art and just making every course better.
That's so good. We only have a few minutes left, but let's talk about how we could use these, because you've had this book out for a couple of years and the others just coming out. But this seems to be something I would want to pass on to parents and grandparents.
Yeah.
And obviously we're talking during the Christmas season, but especially as we get closer to the 4th of July, this should be mandatory reading for every parent, every grandparent, every child, and every grandchild. What do you think?
Yeah. New Year's Day coming up is the day he wrote that letter.
Yes. Well, that'd be a good time to bring this one back up again.
Yeah, well,
and again, what he was writing, just real quickly, in case people are not familiar, the Danbury Baptists, they really did believe that they wanted to not have an institutional church because many times they were actually persecuted in America. People don't know that, but that was certainly the case. So they're writing to Thomas Jefferson saying, okay, what's going to happen now? We, of course, have had George Washington. We've had John Adams. Now we have you. But are we going to still have this idea of the institutions being separate? And if so, what does that mean? And that's why he explains that the institutions will be separate and will protect the church from the state. Is that right?
Exactly right. Yeah. The wall protects the church. It doesn't necessarily keep the church from practicing their beliefs at all. It just keeps the government from telling them what to believe.
Yes. One last one I thought I would ask. You have a case before the Supreme Court right now. I always like to end with a prayer, and the prayer should be for an individual, Gabe Olivier, who is again, this is amazing, an evangelist in Mississippi, of all places, and told that he can't share his faith. Now, I'm not sure anywhere the founders said, well, you have the freedom of speech, but only in a 10 by 10 square box that you can actually share your faith in.
There's a line in Our First Liberty that says, what people believe will never deprive it to practice their faith in public or private.
Yes.
And he's just trying to do that.
And so that is a case before the Supreme Court. They've heard the oral arguments. Yeah. And so it's now up to the Supreme Court. And I suspect that one will come down as well. I'm hoping it's not 5-4, 6-3. You've had the most recent case, you had 9-0. Wouldn't that be something if that was the case? But that is your prayer target for today. And again, let me just mention, if you go to the website, we do have a Pray for America. We may even make that our Pray for America. I think the one coming out right now is about anti-Semitism for obvious reasons, but we may even create that one just to be praying for the Gabe Olivier case, which you have right before the Supreme Court. And if you're 10-0 and then 11-0, you take that, right?
Oh, yes.
We'll take winning.
We had the argument on December 3rd.
Yeah.
And they usually announce their verdicts in June or July. So I don't know why they wait so long.
Well, in the old days, sometimes they would announce controversial decisions and then take off to Europe. But we will see. Yeah. So again, we certainly appreciate all the people there at First Liberty Institute. You're not a lawyer. Don't pretend to be a lawyer, but you have educated us in ways that certainly will allow us to know a lot more about the law. And so thank you for writing all three of these books. And I got a feeling you're not done. You probably have some other ideas coming along.
That's the plan.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah. Again, Howard Goldthwaite, if you'd like to know more about him, you can see his picture. We have a link that will take you to First Liberty. We have all of the videos up there. You can watch them right now. You might want to download them. You might want to go and get the flip book, and all of that is available at the website pointofview.net. We come back, we're going to get into some issues in the news. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give the point of view today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time looking at a couple of issues. One which for a minute might seem a little bit abstract and maybe a little less interesting, but I think it illustrates exactly how different the Trump administration is looking at issues related to the military and foreign policy. And with that as a background, we have each time a new administration writes what is called a national security strategy. And Victor Davis Hanson has written about that, but I'm going to get to that second, because I first started paying attention to this because of some of the other writings that people are addressing there as well. And Glenn Beck is one of those individuals, because Glenn Beck said that if we are looking at what is happening right now in the administration, he believes, I'll now quote him for just a minute, America is standing in a doorway, and what is happening is maybe to have an opportunity to move past some of the chaos, he says, that we've lived through. He says we've seen weakness and drift, bipartisan statements, even the foreign policy class that is oftentimes said have squandered some of the greatest advantage any nation has had. And he says maybe for the first time in decades, this new strategy, which is, again, the national security strategy put down by the Trump administration, and I've got to believe that Pete Hegseth and others were involved in writing this as well, admits the obvious, and that is we sort of lost our way after the Cold War. Another person I am sure who contributed to this is Marco Rubio. Many months ago, we had Marco Rubio on before, and now I guess I'd have to say a year ago, we had Marco Rubio on before he was Secretary of State, because he had written a book about that very issue. So I suspect that is the case. And one of the concerns that certainly Glenn Beck has talked about is that he says we treated global institutions as if they outrank the Constitution. Now, we just talked about the Constitution, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights with Howard Goldthwaite last hour, but it goes on to point out the fact that we, in some cases, protected everybody else's borders, but we let ours collapse. And so the argument is that we needed a strategy that would make the Republic republic strong, that you would have strong families, strong industry, strong borders, strong energy, really a renewed culture that was willing to speak the American story. And at a time in which you had mass migration and uncontrolled borders, that was certainly of concern. Now, what I think is so interesting is you see a perfect indication and connection between the conversation we had last hour with Howard Goldthwaite in his new book, The First Liberty, which, of course, has to do with the Bill of Rights, and then also the one on Founded on Freedom on the Declaration. Because if you read the National Security Strategy, interestingly enough, they talk about the fact that we have a responsibility of the government to protect God-given rights. And Glenn Beck says, now where does that idea come from? Well, it's found in the Bill of Rights. It's found in the First Amendment. It's not controversial, but it is controversial for people that don't necessarily hold to constitutional principles like ours. And so as a result, then this goes on to talk about, which I'll talk about in the second segment in just a few minutes, because then he begins to not only talk about our rights, but then the rights of other people within our own hemisphere. That gets us into the Monroe Doctrine, gets us into what's oftentimes referred to as the Trump corollary, in which you have this opportunity to not only begin to assert your power and influence around the world, but also protect individuals here in the Western Hemisphere. And so the argument that they are making in this document is that we, if we are looking at what is happening, for example, in Europe, we see a culture that is dying. Western civilization is dying. Uncontrolled migration, censorship, declining birth rates, regulatory suffocation, and much, much more. And that, of course, then brings us to the piece by Victor Davis Hanson. But the first one by Glenn Beck, I appreciate him in some respects calling our attention to it. But here, the first article that we have here by Victor Davis Hanson, or at least it's the first article for the second hour, it'd be the second one since we had one last hour on the founders, begins to point out what we believe is a concern. And one of the things that is discussed in the National Security Strategy is that Europe is experiencing what they call civilization erasure. That is, the fact is that Europe no longer wants to defend itself or even defend Western culture. It is bogged down with a huge welfare state and in some respects inability to even appreciate some of the things that have given the rise of the Western world, the Western civilization. And so even though this was done as an attempt to provide brotherly love, Victor Davis Hanson points out Europeans take it as being condescending and maybe interfering in their own internal affairs. Yet that is something that J.D. Vance has talked about. Certainly President Trump has talked about as well. One of the other issues that people have been critical of is the fact that there isn't a whole lot in the national security strategy to condemn Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, part of the reason for that is you're not going to be able to challenge him if Europeans were not willing to pay some of the freight for NATO. It does say that now Europeans have promised to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on military matters and promise someday to increase that. But that's the point. We aren't necessarily always there to be the backstop for you or to protect you. You need to be willing to protect yourself. This then, of course, leads to a whole section, which we'll talk about after the break, and that is the whole issue of what is oftentimes called the Monroe Doctrine, or some people have referred to it as the new Monroe Doctrine or the Trump corollary. And in the national security strategy says that we have allowed Panama to be colonized, that is the Panama Canal, by Chinese, and we've allowed Russians and Chinese and Iranians to be involved in narco-terrorism, in particular with Venezuela and maybe even with Colombia. So after the break, I want to spend some time addressing that issue because it points out that this is of concern, if for no other reason than 75,000 Americans each year are dying because of drugs like fentanyl. And so we're going to talk about how this relates very much to what is happening in Venezuela. And the next article is talking about the active pursuit that the Trump administration has now proceeded for of trying to interdict a third Venezuelan oil tanker. Why are we spending so much time and attention as a country about Venezuela? When we come back from the break, I want to give you a couple of very important reasons, both politically and economically, why Venezuela matters. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During the Christmas week, I like to revisit some of the Christmas carols we sing at this time of the year. In this case, I not only want to talk about one of those songs, but also point you to a film that gives you the backstory. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was known as America's poet and is known for the song I Heard the Bells. His story is faithfully told by the ministry Sight and Sound, which is best known for their live theater productions. I Heard the Bells was their first ever theatrical release, shown in theaters in December 2022. It is now available to you to purchase or to stream into your home. His song came at the end of a tragedy. In 1861, 2 years before writing this poem, his life was shaken when his wife was fatally burned in a fire. Her dress caught on fire, and he tried to extinguish the flames as best he could. She died the next morning, and his facial burns were so severe he couldn't even attend her funeral. He grew a beard to cover his burns and often feared that he would be committed to an asylum due to his grief. His oldest son, Charles, joined the Union Army without his father's blessing. After the Battle of Charlottesville, he fell ill with typhoid fever and was sent home to recover. He was able to rejoin his unit and was severely wounded at the Battle of New Hope Church in Virginia. Longfellow, a widowed father of 6 children, the oldest nearly paralyzed, reflected not only on his grief, but the country fighting a war against itself. He wrote a poem to capture the dissonance in his own heart and the world around him as he heard the Christmas bells. This Christmas season, we need to reflect on the hope we have in Christ, even in the midst of trials and tragedies that surround us. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to be talking for just a few more minutes about the national security strategy. You can read it for yourself. As a matter of fact, there's some links, and I would encourage you to read it if you'd like. But I'm trying to give you, if you will, kind of the Cliff's Notes version of it, and to illustrate now, if I can, for just a few minutes, why Venezuela is important. And again, we will get into some other issues after the break. Matter of fact, I've got 2 very good articles on the issue of affordability, which affect you on a day-to-day basis. So even if you say, well, foreign policy is interesting, but it's not really affecting how I can pay for gas or groceries, I understand. But I think for just a few more minutes, let me, if nothing else, try to answer some questions that many of you have been asking. Why all this military activity in Venezuela and in the Caribbean? And I think there's some very good reasons for that. And I think it's illustrated by a piece by Walter Russell Mead, in which he's referring to what's called the Trump corollary. Let me explain. He says the White House 2025 national security strategy, which we've just been talking about, is unique. He says these documents reflect the views of a sitting president's closest aides and usually result from a carefully choreographed bureaucratic process. The picture that is actually with this article has a picture of Donald Trump, and on one side is the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and on the other side, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which I think illustrates two individuals who almost always accompany him when he's involved in various foreign policy issues. And the fact that that picture shows those three individuals illustrates a great deal. And so then this particular article goes on and quotes from a number of people from the White House, the New York Times, and the rest. But I thought I would quote from just one, Niall Ferguson, somebody we've quoted on this program before, a British-American historian who, writing in the Free Press, he says, definitely highlights the key line in this national security strategy. He says, quote, "We will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine." This, as Mr. Ferguson notes, echoes Theodore Roosevelt's so-called Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine set forth in 1904. You know, last hour we were talking about James Monroe, and the Monroe Doctrine was, we are in the Western Hemisphere, and we're not going to allow other foreign entities to control this hemisphere. Back then, they're talking about France and England and Italy and Spain and others. Now we're talking about Russia, China, Iran, and a variety of others. But the point that Walter Russell Mead makes is the American Armada in the Caribbean isn't just logging sea time, it's enforcing the Trump corollary against Nicolas Maduro's regime, which welcomes the influence of countries hostile to the U.S., drives millions of citizens into migration, and thrives on corrupt alliances of narco-trafficking cartels. So let me get into that for just a minute, because one very good article that I've posted here for you to read is the fact that we have, first of all, picked up one oil tanker from Venezuela. Over the weekend on Saturday, picked up a second one, and this is about the U.S. Coast Guard in hot pursuit of a sanctioned dark fleet tanker near Venezuela on Sunday. And the point that they make is this tanker was flying under a false flag, and so one that they wanted to actually pull in. Why did they want to do that? Well, first of all, these are individuals through the sale of oil that are propping up the Maduro regime. Now, Nicolas Maduro has been defeated in election, if I count right, twice, and is still serving there. So first of all, he's not the duly elected president or leader of Venezuela. Number two, he has been propped up in large part by selling oil to various countries that don't necessarily deserve that oil because there are sanctions. There's sanctions against them and others. And so this has been one of the reasons for the United States military, in this particular case it was the Coast Guard, but in other cases the Navy, that have actually done so. And on Saturday, the United States seized a second oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, according to Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. And so this is, again, the first interception was on December 10th. The second one was, interestingly enough, on December 20th, and of course the third one probably as well. And so you have the U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi posting a video of the seizure, and as a result, this is something that is receiving support from the Department of War. A lot of people say, well, why so much attention on Venezuela? Well, the first is for the fact that you have the number of individuals that have died from fentanyl. I already mentioned those numbers, but here's a statistic that you might want to write down if you are trying to make your case to a friend, neighbor, coworker, family member, member of Congress. Fentanyl is the leading cause of death for those age 18 to 45. You really don't need to know anything else. When we talk about narco-terrorism, that is the case. We also, of course, have hundreds of thousands of people from Venezuela that have come here. And many of them are not individuals coming here because they want a better standard of living. They are coming here with drug trafficking and terrorism in mind. Let me leave this article for just a minute and point out that this news story just came down from just miles south of where we're broadcasting right now. Federal prosecutors in Houston have unsealed sweeping terrorism and drug trafficking charges against senior leaders of the violent Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. All four men, ranging in ages from 24 to 48, are accused of conspiring to provide and providing material support to Tren de Aragua as a designated foreign terrorist organization. If convicted on all charges, the men face up to life in prison and fines up to $10 million. Two of these men are believed to be among the top three leaders of this Venezuelan gang, and the State Department, as we've pointed out, has designated Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization and a specially designated global terrorist group earlier this year. So what we're talking about are individuals that were not only allowed to leave Venezuela, but even encouraged to do so that they could be involved in drug trafficking, so that they could even be involved in terrorist activities. Let's also point out that if you go to Venezuela right now, you will see that there are individuals from other countries which threaten us as well. That would be China, would be Russia, that'd be Iran, to mention just a few. And so those issues politically are a justification for us to bring some kind of pressure so that eventually Nicolas Maduro will leave. And there have been opportunities for him to leave. Are we going to put boots on the ground? I sincerely doubt it. By the way, let me be real blunt. I certainly hope not. But can we bring about some kind of pressure? That certainly would end some of the political issues. And don't forget that some of the biggest problems we have faced from some of the people that we have wanted to deport have been those who have come from Venezuela. So again, if you are turning a blind eye to all of that, as the previous administration seemed to do so, that's political justification enough. But there's also the issue of oil. At this point, you might say, what do you mean? I mean, we have probably more oil being produced through fracking and through shale oil. Yes, but it's a different kind of oil. Won't get into all the details here, but the kind of oil that we have had most of our refineries use to refine have been the heavy oil. That's the kind of oil that we used to produce here in the United States. But today, where is one of the countries that has the greatest amount of that heavy oil? Well, that would be Venezuela. That also, number two, would be Canada. And so when you talk about the fact that we have refineries, some in the northern part of the United States for Canada, but most of those in Texas and Louisiana, they are set up to actually refine the so-called heavy oil. It's dark, it's viscous, it's very different than the sort of light shale oil that we get today, which is certainly very good. But we have refineries that certainly could take advantage of that kind of oil, and certainly by once again redeveloping some of the oil in Venezuela, that would improve the standard of living for the people living in Venezuela. It also would allow us to be able to refine that oil and benefit from it as well. So there are lots of political and economic reasons for why Donald Trump, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of State are focusing time and attention on Venezuela. There's probably more, but that's enough for this segment. When we come back, we'll talk about the issue of affordability. It's going to be an important issue in the campaign. We'll be right back.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention that we have a couple other issues I want to talk about. One, of course, is the issue of affordability, but for my Georgia listeners, really actually for people all over the country, you've probably been hearing, certainly in Georgia, but I think it's important for everybody to recognize that we now have 315,000 votes from the 2020 election. Now, this is 5 years ago, that were not certified accurately, and I think it was worth just a mention, but it illustrates again some of the concerns that people had from that particular era and the election of Joe Biden over Donald Trump. But David Cross has been, over the last 5 years, as sort of a citizen investigator, uncovered proof of widespread irregularities, that's a nice way to phrase it, I suppose, of election results in Fulton County, Georgia. I've seen some in other parts of Georgia, too, so I'll just pick on Fulton County for the moment, in which they found no less than 134 tabulator tapes representing 350,000 votes that did not have signatures. But you might have, well, what's a few 100,000 votes amongst friends, right? Even besides the missing signatures, interestingly enough, David Cross found multiple other red flags in the records he reviewed. He said, we found identical protective counters across several different polling places, polls that were opened 8 days late, polls opened at impossibly late hours like 2 in the morning, poll closing times that do not match the tapes, and on and on and on and on. And interesting enough, the Fulton County Board of Registration and Electors said, we don't dispute the allegations. And so, again, this is from one of those contested elections in 2020. And, of course, many of you remember how Georgia was a swing state and an important state, and there were certainly questions about that, which led then the next year to the legislature in Georgia actually putting together what were called election integrity laws. And you remember the reaction to that. The reaction was that this is Jim Crow 2.0. This is outrageous. This is a reason that the Major League actually decided to pull the All-Star game from Atlanta and take it to Denver. There was all sorts of hue and cry from President Biden and many others. But let's just acknowledge that after some of these voting irregularities in 2020, Fulton County made significant changes since the 2020 election with, and I'm quoting them now, new leadership and a new building and a new board and new standard operating procedures. Anyway, this is something that has surfaced, and this is just, again, for many people, old news, but it isn't old news if it affected certain elections, and I think that it did. And so there we are now 5 years later finding out some things that many of us suspected at the time. So I just thought I'd mention that since we have quite a number of listeners in Georgia. But even if you're not a listener in Georgia, maybe it's worth knowing that they've been able to dig up some of the things that were always of concerning at the time. But let's get to the issue of affordability. This one by Lisa Finley, why the affordability crisis is most severe in California. You know, when we talk about affordability, it's going to be the buzzword of the 2026 elections, no doubt about it. It was already the buzzword of the 2025 election, so that is the case. But if you look at the metro areas, which have some of the lowest consumer price index, Dallas, Houston, Phoenix, Atlanta, things like that. Okay, let's look at the ones that have the 4 metro areas which have the highest, or at least more than 3%, and that would be Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Riverside, California. 3 in the state of California, and I think you can understand why. She says, for example, consider housing. Among the reasons for higher consumer price index readings in California's metro areas are what? Fast rising housing costs. Okay, there's some reasons for that. She says, for example, blame the state's litigation-friendly environmental laws and strict zoning, which raise construction costs and suppress development. And then she starts giving you all sorts of numbers. And I don't read a lot of numbers on radio because it's kind of hard to get them in your head. But that's fine because you can actually pull this article out of the website, pointofview.net, and see the numbers for Riverside and San Diego and others, and then compare them to very low percentages for places like Dallas and Houston and Phoenix. So, first of all, housing. Also, it shows up in terms of the number of building permits. Only 118,000 building permits for new homes were issued for the Los Angeles metro region, which is a population of almost 13 million people. Yet, when you compare that to Atlanta, you have 163,000 for Atlanta, 187,000 for Phoenix, 276,000 for Houston, 281,000 for Dallas. The point is there's no comparison. If you were to put that on a graph, you would see a small number for Los Angeles with a population of 12 million and very large numbers for Atlanta with 6 million, or Phoenix with 5 million, Dallas with 8 million. And you would see that, again, that is the case. And she then goes on to say one reason housing prices have remained stubbornly high in Florida is just a lack of construction workers. Which brings us back to one of our favorite conversations here. You don't have to go to college if you'd like to make a good income. Construction is one place. We've talked about welding and being mechanics and all sorts of things. That is the case. But, of course, there's some other issues related, not just housing, but she points out that Democrats in California, it's not that they just don't want to build, they also don't want to drill. The state's large number of climate policies have driven up energy prices in San Diego, Riverside, and Los Angeles, even while they've been following in places like Atlanta, Phoenix, Houston, and, of course, Dallas. And so, again, you see the same kind of thing unfolding there as well. And then she points out one other issue, legal abuse. That is the whole issue of the kind of tort reform that needs to take place in certain areas. Los Angeles has oftentimes been referred to by the American Tort Reform Foundation as a judicial hellhole. You can take it for what it's worth, but it begins to look at all the legal issues. And if that's not enough, just even going out there and being able to buy some food is expensive, because in many of these states, in California, we're going to now see this up in Washington, especially in Seattle right now with our new Democratic Socialist mayor there, minimum wage high prices are going up dramatically. And she says higher state mandated minimum wages can also increase the price of a hamburger. The cost of eating out has climbed 14% in San Diego, 12% in Riverside, whereas Democrats increased the state minimum wage for fast food employees up to $20 an hour. And so, again, when we talk about affordability, we need to recognize that there's the big and broad issue of the federal government. And then there's the local government issues as well. And even though people tend to want to blame the president or the senator or even the congressman, some of those decisions are made at the legislative level. Some of them are made at the congressional level, yes. Some of them are made at the city council level. And it just really depends where you are talking about. But if nothing else, while this issue of affordability is going going to be sort of a textbook issue, and it's certainly going to be one that will be certainly during the election of 2026. She says California offers a textbook example of how to make life unaffordable. The lesson for the president: when government makes it harder and more expensive for businesses to do what they want to do, consumers pay the price. So in some respects, we can learn some lessons vicariously from certain states where it is more affordable than other states, and we can learn that some of this has to do with things like housing. Some of it has to do with various kinds of regulations. Some of it has to do with whether or not you are allowing for energy production and the kinds of regulations you put on the kind of gasoline or diesel that you put into your car or to your truck. Some of it has to do with legal abuse, which we just talked about, and some of it simply has to do with trying to raise the minimum wage so high that it makes it very difficult for some people just to even afford to buy a hamburger. So again, when we talk about affordability, I think it's really important to put some of that in context. We will hope that at least some thinking voters in 2026 will put that in context and recognize that, yeah, you might want to throw a member of Congress out, but you might also want to think about who you put in the governor's mansion, who you put into the city council, who you put into the legislature. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes while we're talking about affordability. I thought I would look at it one more way, and it's almost kind of like a kaleidoscope. You know how you turn it and you see something a little bit different? Every time you get into this issue of affordability, as I pointed out just a minute ago, affordability might have a lot to do with what's happening in a local community, what may be happening in a particular state. And so when people look at the national figures, certainly there are differences between the affordability, say, in the Midwest compared to, say, California. The difference between an energy-rich state like Texas and one that may be in a place where there's very little drilling. So I understand that there is going to be some variation, but there's another element of this, and this is why, again, if you are promoting the so-called Green New Deal, which has been part and parcel of what has been promoted by progressives, primarily in the Democratic Party, you have to recognize that affordability and the Green New Deal are at odds with one another. And this comes from a piece by Larry Behrens. Never had him on the program. Maybe we should have him on sometime, but he's with Power the Future. He's an energy expert, and he points out, first of all, let's look at it nationally. And nationally, the average price for a gallon of gasoline is now lower than it's been in 4 years. And we've been talking about that, and probably next week we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what it is in any particular area of the country. And as you might imagine, it is going to be more expensive in a lot of the blue states with a lot of the regulations and taxes and those kinds of things. But now he takes us down to something very different. What is oftentimes the case in terms of affordability is negatively affected by some of these policies, and part and parcel, that's the Green New Deal. He says the usual suspects of lawmakers who are now feigning outrage, declaring affordability a crisis, and pretending to be the champions of working families, yet they are the same failed politicians who proudly championed the Green New Deal, a radical agenda that would impose massive, unavoidable costs on American households. Now, I do go into that in some detail in one of our books on energy and ecology, but there may be some value in pointing you to a very good piece that came out by Dr. Merrill Matthews a number of years ago in The Hill. You can type in Merrill Matthews and Green New Deal. As I jokingly said, he's one of the few we've had on the program that's read every single word of the Green New Deal, lived to tell about it, by the way, and points out that a lot of it has nothing to do with the environment. But He then, that is Larry Behrens, goes and takes you through a little bit of a summary. He says, let's start with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Recently, AOC, he says, took to social media to complain about affordability and blame others for rising costs. But he says people are supposed to forget that when she was discussing the Green New Deal in 2019, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez admitted that the plan would cost trillions upon trillions of dollars. She said that. As a matter of fact, he gives you a link, and you can follow the link and check it out for yourself. You don't have to believe him. You don't have to believe me. That some estimates estimated $93 trillion by some estimates. He says that's not a typo. Trillion with a T. So how can you, on the one hand, talk about the fact that we need to spend trillions and trillions of dollars on the Green New Deal, and then turn right around and say, I'm really concerned about affordability for working families? Sometimes it's important for the mainstream media to maybe call her to account on the discrepancy between the two. We just mentioned California, so I'll pick that one, but we'll also get to Bernie Sanders and a few others. You have, of course, California Governor Gavin Newsom, who, again, he says, has recently discovered the concern for household budgets. And since he is most likely going to run for the presidency. But he says again, that is, Larry Behrens says, California people know this because during his tenure, California has now developed the second highest electricity rates in the nation. Energy bills have skyrocketed, driven by aggressive green mandates, renewable quotas, and regulatory strangling of renewable and reliable power sources, which again, I think are going to show up eventually in some of the presidential discussions and debates. He then goes on and spends some time quoting from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and a variety of others, complaining again about the cost of eggs and beef and other staples while they, of course, travel around the country on private jets, but also are lecturing us about climate change and the need for us to implement the various aspects of the Green New Deal. And he points out that studies that have analyzed the Green New Deal style policies estimate that the first-year compliances alone would exceed $70,000 for a typical household when you factor in vehicles, home energy systems, and appliances. And again, these are quotes that are tied back to people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And again, you might say, well, maybe I want to look up that study, and we've quoted it before years ago, of this first year cost could actually increase your family budget by $70,000. And so then he quotes from U.S. Representative Ro Khanna and a variety of others. But the point he makes is simply this. The Green New Deal is not something you want to implement if you're concerned about affordability. But he also goes on and says something else that Dr. Merrill Matthews has pointed out on this program. And that is the Green New Deal, he says, is not a climate plan. It's a cost transfer scheme that forces families to absorb massive expenses while at the same time, many times, politicians virtue signal from podiums in private jets. From higher gasoline prices, soaring electricity bills, or mandatory purchases families cannot afford, the result is always the same. Less freedom, less affordability, more government control. So again, this is a piece that goes on to 4 pages. It has a number of links to the original studies, many of which we've cited here in the past. So again, as affordability becomes a big issue in the 2026 election, I think it's important to recognize that those individuals now complaining about affordability are some of the ones that we're wanting to implement, and were able, through some of the things passed under the Biden administration, we're able to implement some things that have made affordability a fleeting dream because of how those were implemented. So again, you can find some of those articles on our website today at Point of View. Don't trust me. Don't trust some of the things we say. Read it for yourself. Follow the links. You'll come, I believe, to the very same conclusion. You know, we began today with Howard Goldthwaite, and again, is just a reminder of one of the benefits of supporting Point of View. I'm holding up here some of the booklets, one on One Nation Under God, one on the Patriot Pastors, one on the Federalist Papers, one on constitutional interpretation, even one on church state. And these are booklets that we make available to those of you that join with us on a monthly basis. I might just mention that I'll hold up our Outlook magazine, and if you support us on a monthly basis, you will receive the magazine. But if you support us at the Truth Team level, which is at least $1 a day, at least $30 a month or more, you'll receive these booklets, and many of these kinds of booklets will land in your mailbox as a thank you for your support. So as we come to year end, we're just a week away from that year end. Let me encourage you to go to our website right now. There's a banner that says we have a matching challenge. We would encourage you to click on that banner and support this ministry. Most importantly, I want to thank Megan and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Do not miss the fact that this is an exciting time in America. Record numbers of Gen Z returning to church, reading the Bible. God is clearly moving. But it's also a critical time. Without trustworthy biblical guidance, without spiritual mentors willing to disciple, those young people full of zeal today could be led astray tomorrow. And that's why I urge you to partner with Point of View and equip the mentors the next generation needs. When you support Point of View, you provide a wealth of resources to equip Americans to think biblically about every issue relevant to life today. Your support could supply the tools that someone needs to apply biblical truth in discipleship. So partner with us today, and your gift will be doubled through December 31st. So give today at pointofview.net, or you can call us 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.